The United Nations and its institutions have a credibility they do not deserve and have become a threat to freedom and democracy in the world. Israel's case before the UN's International Court of Justice should be used to expose this fact and begin the process of placing clear boundaries on the UN. I'm Warren Goldstein, the Chief Rabbi of South Africa, and here is why I say that. The UN is imbued with credibility and respect that it does not deserve. And with the Israel case, a prime example, its institutions have been increasingly hijacked by undemocratic societies to advance objectives that threaten freedom, peace, and prosperity in the world. Consider that of the 193 members of the UN General Assembly, only 84 are ranked as free societies by Freedom House, a think tank in New York City, or that of the 47 members of the UN Human Rights Council, whose very reason for existence is to protect and uphold human rights, only 13 can be defined as fully economically and politically free, according to the Social Research Foundation Global Freedom Scores. How is it possible that the UN's top human rights body is dominated by countries that don't respect human rights? Many UN decisions are passed by simple majorities. What does it say about the quality and integrity of those decisions if these majority voting blocs are to a large extent made up of autocratic regimes? What does it say about the UN as a protector of human rights and international justice if the majority of its members have no regard for the values of freedom and democracy, or indeed of human rights? Only a minority of UN members represent governments which ascribe fully to Western democratic values of freedom of speech and religion, free markets, property rights, and the rule of law. What are free societies doing, ceding their national security and strategic interests to the judgment of their repressive authoritarian enemies? It is a glaring question, and few democratic governments have a good answer, which is something the current International Court of Justice case can hopefully help to change. The question is especially vexing considering that for a majority of UN General Assembly members, the values and freedoms of democratic societies are seen as a threat. Yet this majority, together with the UN Security Council, gets to appoint the judges that sit on the International Court of Justice, the body that is adjudicating the case against Israel. In my PhD thesis on human rights and constitutional law, I explored how the appointment of judges is at the heart of justice. The book of Exodus describes how Moses established the world's first multi-tiered society-wide judiciary more than 3,300 years ago. Together with the Talmud, it details the painstaking process through which judges are appointed and the lofty qualities and unimpeachable integrity those judges are required to possess. The famous biblical verse, Tzedek, Tzedek Tirdof, justice, justice you shall pursue, refers, says the Talmud, to the moral duty to submit your case only before a worthy and upstanding bench of judges. Justice is only as good as the judges who dispense it. Therefore, who appoints the judges is absolutely critical. And the UN, dominated by dictatorships, appoints the ICJ judges, who therefore by definition lack the moral authority to stand in judgment over any democracy, especially Israel. The UN's anti-Israel bias and obsession with the world's only Jewish state and the only free democracy in the Middle East makes this point clear. Consider that at the General Assembly each year there are more condemnations of Israel than the rest of the world combined. In 2022, for example, 15 resolutions passed against Israel and not a single resolution passed on the human rights situation in China, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Cuba, Turkey, Egypt, Zimbabwe, Pakistan, Qatar, Vietnam, Algeria. On the other hand, Iran, Syria, North Korea, Myanmar each received a grand total of 1. Consider that at the UN Human Rights Council, Israel is the only country with a standing agenda item, and that in 17 years, the UN's Human Rights Council has adopted 103 resolutions condemning Israel, compared to 0 for countries guilty of real human rights violations, such as China, Venezuela, and Saudi Arabia. Finally, consider that among the ICJ judges hearing this case, one is from serial human rights abuser China and another is from Lebanon. if you can believe that, where Hezbollah, an Iranian proxy and combatant in the current war on Israel, is a key member of the government. This is theater of the absurd, where a democracy such as Israel can be brought before the ICJ to face charges related to its national security imperative to fight off jihadist terror that is financed and supported by Iran with the declared intent of waging war against the West and destroying the values that free democracies are built upon. For constitutional democracies to submit themselves to the judgment of UN institutions is ludicrous. Israel stands no chance of a fair trial and should take no part in the UN's ICJ charade, other than to cite some of the above statistics to make the argument that the International Court of Justice has no moral jurisdiction over it, and then to withdraw from the process. When in 1948, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion agreed for Israel to join the Geneva Conventions, it was not on the understanding that the UN would become a cesspit of anti-Semitism that would twist the genocide clause to put Israel's right to self-defense on trial in the midst of a multi-front war for survival. The UN's gross bias against Israel places it in breach of these agreements signed at the establishment of the Jewish state to accept the authority of the ICJ to adjudicate its actions. Now, I believe, is the time to walk away from this dangerous farce. In support, pro-freedom and democracy activists, politicians, and think tanks should lobby their governments to do the same. Doing so would make a clear statement that no UN body can exercise authority over Israel or any free society's sovereignty, and certainly not over national security decisions, such as how to conduct an existential war of self-defense. International institutions may be useful as forums for a majority of countries in the world, regardless of their democratic status and value systems, to meet to negotiate global events. But constitutional democracies should neither submit nor cede their defensive and strategic interests to the judgment of what are indirectly the strategic objectives of their ideological enemies. And media and opinion formers in the free world should become much more circumspect in the credibility they grant UN institutions. If nation states in the free world feel at all inclined to cede their sovereign rights to third parties, those third parties should at a minimum subscribe fully to the values of liberal democracy. The time has come to build a new global alliance comprising free societies with shared values and a sincere commitment to human rights. What we see in Israel's case before the ICJ is a majority of non-free societies weaponizing a UN platform to undermine the defensive rights of a liberal democracy. Allow that precedent to continue, and the outlook for freedom in the world is dire. Exercising moral clarity, Israel has an historic opportunity to stand up for the freedom and independence of constitutional democracies throughout the world. Let us realize that none of these challenges are new. In the 1940s, an important part of Nazi propaganda was to accuse the Jews and the Allied forces of seeking to exterminate the German people. Here is an extract from a document published in October 1942 in the German press, which accuses the Royal Air Force of, and I quote, terror attacks against the civilian population, with the intent to exterminate the German people by the attacks against military hospitals, schools, churches, military rescue ships, ambulance and emergency aircraft, and the systematic bombing raids against a German main military medical aid station in North Africa. End quote. In doing so, the document states, England has, and I quote, placed itself outside the Geneva Convention and therefore outside civilized nations. End quote. The role players are different. The story is the same. Iran is today's Nazi Germany seeking to exterminate the Jewish people through its barbaric genocidal proxy Hamas. And Israel is in the dock for breaching the Geneva Convention. It doesn't get more bizarre than this. The words of Israel's then ambassador to the United Nations, Chaim Herzog, later Israel's president, come to mind. In 1975, he addressed the UN General Assembly on the eve of another one of its many fits of blatant anti-Semitism, when it was about to pass its infamous Zionism is racism resolution. He ended his speech with these words, and I quote, "I stand here not as a supplicant, for the issue is not Israel or Zionism. The issue is the continued existence of the UN organization, which has been dragged to its lowest point of discredit by a coalition of despotism and racists. This resolution, based on hatred, falsehood, and arrogance, is devoid of any moral or legal value. For us, the Jewish people, this is no more than a piece of paper, and we shall treat it as such." And then he tore up the resolution. Israel should give the International Court of Justice summons the same treatment. The stakes could not be higher. The fate of the entire world is at stake. As the great ethical work of the Talmud, Pirkei Avot, states, the world stands on three things: justice, truth, and peace. Al-Hadin, ve'al-ha'emet, ve'al-ha'shalom. God has created the world such that without these pillars, human civilization crumbles. But note the order: first justice and truth, and then peace. Around 1800 years ago, in the ancient and eternal capital of the Jewish people, the great sages of the Jerusalem Talmud explained that without justice and truth, there can be no peace. And so Israel must stand firm against the intimidation of the United Nations and its so-called International Court of Justice. Israel must stand firm in the name of justice and truth. For as the prophet Isaiah said, Tzion b'mishpat tipadeh, Zion will be redeemed through justice. The route to redemption and the path to peace begins with justice, true justice.